The polar bear is one of the largest predators on the planet and is a member of the bear family. The great polar bear is the epitome of strength. Since ancient times, the polar bear has been a respected character in the folklore of indigenous northern peoples. In this video you will get a description of the polar bear, learn many new and interesting things about this large and strong predator of the north. The polar bear looks very large and is one of the largest animals in the world. In addition, the polar bear is a predator. The big polar bear looks huge because it can reach 3 meters in length, and the polar bear can weigh as much as a ton. The mass of a polar bear is one of the main components of its impressive size. But such large polar bears are not common. The average male polar bear weighs 450 kilograms and has a body length of 2 to 2.5 meters. Female bears are much smaller. The female polar bear weighs up to 300 kilograms and has a body length of 2 meters. The polar bear's height at the withers varies from 130 to 150 centimeters. Curiously, the smallest polar bears are found in Spitsbergen, and the largest polar bears live in the Bering Sea. The polar bear looks somewhat different from the other members of the polar bear family. But it's not just the coloration that distinguishes the polar bear from other members of the family. The Arctic polar bear is also distinguished by its long neck and flat head shape. The polar bear is white because it lives among the snow. Surprisingly, the skin of the polar bear is black, the same color he has a nose and lips. The color of the coat of a polar bear varies from completely white to white with a yellowish hue. In summer, the coat of the polar bear under constant exposure to sunlight finally turns yellow. This animal has small ears and a short tail, which is completely invisible under the thick snow-white coat. The fur of the polar bear is very thick, with dense undercoat and quite coarse. The thick coat of the polar bear keeps the body warm and protects it from getting wet. Not only because of its warm fur, the polar bear does not freeze. Under its skin, it has a layer of fat that is about 10 centimeters thick. This layer of fat allows him not to freeze, even in the harshest frosts, and when standing in cold water. The coat of the polar bear has no pigment and its wools are empty inside. Because of this coat structure, polar bears can sometimes turn green. This happens in a climate that is unusual for a polar bear's habitat. When kept in zoos, algae grows inside the bear's fur, which gives the bear a greenish color. The polar bear looks massive. This northern animal is equipped by nature to live in the coldest parts of the globe and to be the perfect predator. The polar northern bear has a warm coat and wool on the soles of its paws, which keeps it from slipping on the ice and freezing. It even has a swimming web between its toes, which makes the polar bear a good swimmer. The polar bear's skin has a thick layer of subcutaneous fat to keep it from freezing in icy water. Also, the great polar bear has large claws and impressive fangs, which allow him to cope even with strong prey. The polar bear lives in the northern hemisphere in the circumpolar regions of the Earth. This animal is unique and absolutely unafraid of the permafrost, as it is adapted to live in the far north with its harsh conditions. The polar bear lives in the vast expanses of the Arctic. The polar bear habitat reaches 88 degrees north latitude in the north and extends to Newfoundland Island in the south. On the mainland, polar bear habitat extends through the deserts of the Arctic to the tundra in the territories of Russia, Canada, the United States, and Greenland. Polar bear life is linked to the Arctic belt and is highly dependent on seasonal changes in polar ice limits. Polar bears live along the entire Greenland coast, inhabit the Greenland sea ice as far south as the Jan Mayen Islands, live on Spitsbergen Island, Franz Josef Land and Novaya Zemlya in the Barents Sea, on the Bear Islands, Vaigach and Kalgev, as well as in the Kara Sea. The largest populations of polar bears are found off the coast of the Laptev and Beaufort Seas, the Chukchi and East Siberian Seas. The maximum population of polar bears is represented by the continental slope of the Arctic Ocean. Polar bears live nomadic lives. During seasonal changes of polar ice boundaries, they move around. In summer, the polar bear moves closer to the pole, and in winter it moves southward, entering the mainland. Polar bears live mostly on the coast and ice, but lie in the den on the mainland or islands. Polar bears hibernate for 1.5 to 2.5 months, and most often pregnant females do so. Male bears and non-pregnant females hibernate for a short time, and not every year. In contrast to such a representative of the bears as the giant panda, the polar bear is a predator. In addition, the polar bear is the only one of the largest terrestrial predators on the planet that tends to stalk and hunt humans, treating them as equal prey. After all, it is not for nothing that the polar bear is one of the most dangerous animals in the world. The polar bear is the king of the north, because it is at the top of the food chain in the Arctic. Often in children's books, the polar bear is depicted in the company of penguins. This can be misleading, as if they inhabit the same pole. But this is not true, because the polar bear lives at the North Pole in the Arctic, and the penguins live at the South Pole in Antarctica. So the answer to the question of why polar bears don't eat penguins is very simple: they live at different poles. The polar bear lives on drifting and perennial sea ice, where it is free to hunt its prey. The polar bear feeds on ringed seals, sea hares, walruses, and other sea animals. He sneaks up on them from behind shelters or stalks them near holes. As soon as an animal shows itself, the bear strikes its prey with one paw. During the hunt, the polar bear can turn over an ice floe with seals on it. However, the Arctic polar bear can only defeat a walrus on land. The polar bear feeds by primarily eating the skin and fat. He can eat a whole carcass only as a last resort and when he is very hungry. Usually foxes finish off the rest. The polar bear also eats carcasses, dead fish, birds' eggs, and chicks. Polar bears sometimes eat grass and seaweed, and in residential areas, they gladly feast on garbage dumps. The polar bear is even capable of robbing the Polar Expedition's food warehouse. Despite the fact that the big polar bear seems clumsy, it is very fast and agile on land. In addition, it swims and dives in water with ease. On land, the polar bear moves at an average speed of 5.5 kilometers per hour, and when running it can reach speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour. The polar bear can cover a distance of up to 20 km on land within a day. In the water, the polar bear can swim for days without stopping, covering up to 160 kilometers a day, with a speed of up to 6.5 kilometers per hour. This animal is very good at swimming and diving, and the Arctic polar bear can stay underwater for up to 2 minutes. The polar bear's fur protects its body from getting wet in icy water, and its layer of subcutaneous fat, 10 centimeters thick, perfectly protects it from the cold. The white coloration perfectly camouflages the predator. Polar bears have very well-developed senses. Excellent hearing, smell and sight help the polar bear easily spot prey at a distance of several kilometers. Even under a meter layer of snow, the polar bear senses prey, and can detect the slightest movement above the shelter of potential prey. Face to face with this predator is better not to meet. After all, polar bears can stalk and hunt humans. Repeated attacks on humans by polar bears have been described in the accounts of polar travelers. In places where there is a risk of encountering this animal, it is necessary to move carefully. In populated areas where this predator may appear nearby, you should take care not to have easy access to garbage cans, which are very attractive to curious bears. The Canadian province of Manitoba is home to many polar bears. The city of Churchill even has a special prison for the temporary detention of bears that come too close to the city. Such measures ensure the safety of the residents. Polar bears tend to live singly. Usually, they are quite peaceful and quiet towards each other, but the breeding season of males is always accompanied by clashes. The mating season of Arctic polar bears is from March to June. During this time, they walk in pairs, but it happens that one female may be followed by several males at once. In October, the females dig a den in the snow drifts on the shore. The bears converge en masse to their favorite places to make a den and raise their cubs. The Wrangel Islands and Franz Josef Land are one of such places, where the females make up to 200 dens every year. Female bears occupy the den only by the end of fall. The whole period of pregnancy lasts 8 months. Polar bear cubs are born towards the end of the Arctic winter. Great polar bears have low fertility because the ability to breed comes only at the age of 4 to 8 years, and the female bear gives birth only once in 2 to 3 years. Usually 1 to 3 polar bear cubs are born. The cubs of the polar bear are born blind, with short sparse hair, and absolutely helpless. They weigh 500 to 800 grams with a body length of only 25 centimeters. The mother feeds the cubs intensively with her nourishing milk. At a little over a month old, the polar bear cubs open their eyes. In March, females begin mass exits from their dens. By 2 months of age, the females gradually take their cubs out for short walks, during which they frolic in the snow. When the polar bear cubs are 3 months old, the female leaves the den and goes with them to roam in the ice-covered deserts of the Arctic. The female feeds her cubs with milk until they are 1.5 years old. But very soon the polar bear cubs begin their own lives. The polar bear lives 25 to 30 years. In captivity, this period may be longer. Sometimes polar bears interbreed with brown bears. The born hybrids are called polar grizzlies. A polar bear cub lives with its mother for up to 1.5 years. The polar bear is listed in the Red Book of Russia and the world with the status of a vulnerable species. The great polar bear has a high mortality rate of 10 to 30% of young animals. The slow reproduction of offspring makes this animal easily vulnerable, and climate change greatly affects the life of polar bears. In addition, it is not uncommon for adult males to attack the young. The polar bear is listed in the Red Book. In 2014, the global number of polar bears was about 25,000. Russia is home to about 7,000 polar bears, with poachers killing up to 150 each year. The great polar bear has no natural enemies. In the water, they can occasionally be attacked by walrus or killer whale. A polar bear cub left unattended by its mother can fall prey to wolves and foxes. But the main threat to the polar bear is man. Despite its protective status, the polar bear suffers from armed poachers.